those of you, I recognise most of you, but there are a few faces I don't know. I'm Harry Dimitriou, head of the Centre. My two co-authors, Rita, John Ward, Phil Wright. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, welcome to those of you who haven't been before to this seminar series on mega projects. I'd like, if I may, to go around the room so people just very quickly tell us who you are, where you're from, and basically what discipline or what program you're taking, so we get some idea of the multidisciplinarity of the group. I won't talk about myself, any details about the background of my colleagues and myself are in that summary. We'll just dive straight in to the presentation, and I'll give you obviously a background to the research work. So perhaps we can start on the left.
Hi everyone, my name is Sherry Bello-Osage. I'm from Nigeria and I'm on the MSc program, Mega Infrastructure, Planning, Appraisal and Forecasting.
Hi, my name is G.Wright. I'm the lecturer of Construction Economics from the Berkeley School of Construction and Project Management.
I'm Tim Stoner. I'm an architect and urban planner. I'm the managing director of Space Syntax Limited, which is a UCL spin-off company, and I've just become a visiting professor at the Barclays.
Congratulations.
Hi, I'm Prof from England, and I'm doing a Masters in Civil Engineering.
Masters in?
Civil Engineering.
Okay.
Hi, my name is April. I'm doing MSc, Mega Infrastructure Planning at Barclays.
I'm Robin Hickman. I'm a lecturer here in Transport Planning at the Barlow.
My name is Dimitriou. I'm an urban planner and I'm on the math course.
My name is Hassan Adetunji. I'm doing MSc in Mega Infrastructure Planning at the Barlow.
Can we take it over there?
Sorry, my name is Julian Chain. I write for a website called Games Monitor about the London Olympics.
Hi, I'm John Ward. I'm from the Omega Centre.
Juan Bolson, architect, 8 years of experience, and I'm doing a Master in Science in Civil Engineering in UCL.
My name is Shane Seeley. I'm a curation student.
I'm Marco Dean. I'm from Italy. I'm a civil engineer and I'm doing mega infrastructure planning.
I'm doing an MSc at the Development Planning Unit.
I'm Adrian Conley. I'm doing an MSc in Civil Engineering in the University of Bath.
Hi, I'm Ken Hong, exchange student from Hong Kong, and I'm doing planning here as well.
I'm a postgraduate student in the urban design course in the School of Architecture.
I'm Brian Garcia. I'm a PhD student and I'm studying transportation and redevelopment.
I'm Helen Chen. I'm from China and I'm doing MSc Mega Infrastructure Planning, Appraisal and Delivery at Barclays.
Hello everyone. I'm Ding Qing Yan. I'm doing Mega Infrastructure Planning, Delivery.
I'm Lisa Lin from China as well. I'm doing the indoor infrastructure planning.
Phil Wright, the Omega Centre.
Danielle Drought. I'm from the United States and Australia. I'm doing an MSc in Urban Studies.
My name is David Simpson. I'm from the Northeast of England. I'm doing a PhD in Transport Centre. It's regarding measuring people over a period of time to see what their mobility is.
I am Ken Conway. I'm an economist and urban planner and a consultant.
I'm Celine. I'm from France and I'm doing my MSc in International Planning and Development.
Okay, thank you very much. Apologies in advance to those who have already seen the beginning of the slides. You wouldn't have seen the other slides before because we've not presented, but in terms of the research methodology, some of you may be familiar with this. What I'm wanting to do today is to, in a very abbreviated form, report to you back some of our principal findings of a 5-year research program in decision making in the planning, appraisal and delivery of mega urban transport infrastructure projects in 10 countries based on 30 case studies. One of the challenges of the field, in fact, all the fields that many of you represent around the table and elsewhere, is how do you communicate the findings following a complex analysis in a manner that doesn't put the audience to sleep or doesn't alienate by virtue of the complexity the audience you're trying to pass on the knowledge to. And there is no doubt about it, mega infrastructure projects deal with extremely complex issue. And of course, one of the most difficult issues we had is how to, at the end of the day, disseminate packages of findings in a manner that are digestible. And if you like, this is one of our earliest attempts to do that. If we were asked, as we in effect are being, to present our key observations and lessons against what we set out to do, we've got 4 major messages that we would like to communicate. Some of them will not be new to some of you. In other instances, they may well be. The first is that mega infrastructure, transport, but also other infrastructure projects, but the ones that we were looking at, really need to be treated, need to be seen, and therefore treated as agents of change, as agents of transformation. Secondly, they need to be treated as open systems. In other words, the boundaries with which they are analysed, assessed, appraised need to recognise that they are part of a wider system, and that this is extremely important in terms, at the end of the day, judging their success or failure. The third, which should be music to some architect ears, those of you who are fans of Christopher Alexander, is that MUTPs, mega urban transport projects, are essentially organic phenomena. They may be engineering artifacts, but if you look at their interface and evolution, interaction with the rest of their physical, economic, political environments, you will see an organic transformation. And therefore, looking at them alone as physical artifacts is to miss what's going on, especially over the long run. Finally, given that mega urban transport projects are too often looked at in terms of the success and failure by the iron triangle criteria of project management, finishing projects on time, finishing on budget, according to specifications, they lead to conclusions that don't take a holistic view of success and failure, with the result that there is a desperate need for a proper framing of MUTP success and failures. In other words, the conclusion, as you will see later on, is that the messages coming out about the disasters, failures, successes of many mega projects are skewed towards a set of criteria that don't take into account the kind of areas that we discovered as important. Now, without wishing to blow one's own trumpet, although of course that's impossible not to do because we're academics, but since the issue here is that, as I was explaining, is that we are reporting on case studies and participants, key decision makers involved in case studies. This is not an academic study written up by academics with academic content. It's actually academics, or in fact not all of us have necessarily a purely academic background, reporting on the evidence provided by key decision makers and politicians involved in the field. So it is evidence-based, not necessarily one that is purely based upon our intellectual framework that relates to a particular theory or a particular position. I should have stated right at the outset, and I apologise to the Volvo Research Foundation, who's not represented here, that we were funded for 5 years to undertake this research with 9 other countries in the United States of America, Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, Italy, France, sorry, not Italy, France, Germany, Greece, the Netherlands here. Who have I left out? Sweden. Yes, again, our funders. not very diplomatic. I had previously been involved in this work, as indeed as my colleague Phil Wright, in mega projects in Hong Kong, where I was advising on the periphery of the government. Phil was in the civil service at the time, very hands-on in the field of the mega projects pre-1997. I was also working in Denmark on some European projects before I came to here to the UK to operationalise this work. And where I was working before was very much under a culture of the failure of big projects. So you may recollect, some of you, that Peter Hall wrote a book on planning disasters in the 1980s. And I was not convinced by this, it appears, universal condemnation that these cost overruns were due to corruptive practices and inflation of traffic forecasts. There was a Machiavellian agenda to it, and of course there is, and depending which country you're dealing with. But I was not convinced that this was the whole story. And more important than that, I was not convinced that you can judge success and failure of mega projects on the basis of these narrow iron triangle criteria. And so I asked the question that any young child would ask. Very often the case, those of you who have got kids, they ask the most intelligent questions very simply, you know. And in this case, the question was, hey guys, what is a successful mega urban transport project? Is it just something that finishes on time, on budget, with the specifications? Because you can have projects finishing on time, within budgets, on the specific, doing the wrong thing, wrong place, with the wrong people. Who's judging what? So, we actually want to find out what those who are involved in the project. I have to say, not those impacted by it. I mean, this was a conscious decision. The key decision makers involved in the project, what their judgment were, how do they judge success and failure of mega projects? Because these are billion-dollar projects plus. The second question, we had done some work beforehand on the treatment of risk, uncertainty, and complexity in decision making, because mega projects have long gestation periods. They have risks within them and risks impacting on them over time. And one of the disappointing, and I'm being polite, characteristics of infrastructure planning and urban regional planning, up until recently, one could say, maybe, is that the treatment of risk and uncertainty, and not so much complexity, treatment of risk and uncertainty is very, very, very weak. And so we decided to look at the lessons in decision making of risk, uncertainty, and complexity in professions and disciplines where these features were at the centre of decision making. For example, in the field of earthquake engineering, which is obvious, insurance, finance, military, and we extracted from that a number of what we consider to be generic lessons, which we tested and brought into our analysis for decision making in mega projects. And so as a result, we then examined how well risk, uncertainty, and complexity has been treated in the planning of mega projects. Bearing in mind, as Peter Hall raised a long time ago, in the 1980s, that, and John Friend as well, that risks, uncertainties, not only in complexities, not only exist within the project, but actually in the environment of the project as the projects evolve, which is a very important point. Finally, in terms of the overall research question, was, okay, what we find, how do we know that this is going to be of generic value anywhere else? We dealt with the countries purposely on the so-called developed economies, and I have worked considerably in Africa and Asia and the Middle East, and I know that the contexts are very different and lead to risks, uncertainties and complexities of the making of the context. So our concern was, well, when we come to our conclusions, after all the 5 years' work, how relevant is it going to be to Nigeria? How relevant is it going to be to Peru or wherever? What is portable here? Bearing in mind that the main actors in mega infrastructure projects are global players who treat this field as portable. The knowledge is portable. So they were the questions. We soon realized that there are some other questions that need clarification in order to do the work. The first one is, well, we talk about mega projects, but actually, when we talk about these projects, very often, we're talking about different things, because where is the boundary of the project? Is the project, in the case of the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, the line haul, the railway line, or is the project the stations, or is the project the stations, the railway line, and the sub-regional area of the Thames Gateway? Because if you don't decide and agree on what the boundaries are of the project, you're going to come up with different criteria of success or failure. As indeed many projects become deemed failures in terms of project management criteria, but are actually deemed successes with a broader agenda. They are deemed a failure in the short run and a success in the long run, or vice versa. Now, the other issue to bear in mind is that judgments of success and failure critically depend upon stakeholder interests. One party's success is another party's failure. So, looking at stakeholder perspectives is critical. Again, we came clean. We, for all the disadvantages that this position adopted, we wanted to understand the thinking of the key decision makers and politicians and engineers and project managers and investors. Yes, there is another research program to be had about those who, the winners and losers of that, the losers in particular, but that's not what we were looking at. The study outputs. Well, one of the issues that we felt needed to be answered was, having spent so many billions of dollars on X, Y, and Z mega project, what contribution do they make, or not make, to sustainable development visions? Going beyond the rhetoric, we are really not a group for rhetoric. I mean, sustainable development visions need to be operationalized and related. But the question needs to be asked, are these projects for the 25, 50-year horizon ahead? And in which case, what are the key challenges and risks that and how well do they perform? We were just talking with the students today with a project with the CTRL and JLE here, of looking at climate change scenarios. And it's quite clear that the climate change scenarios that we are knowledgeable about now have not really been factored into the original planning. So there is an issue, which is another research field, of retrofitting existing projects to adapt to sustainable challenges of the future. Second, is to understand how mega project decision making is a product of context and time. One of the issues may well be that projects are spawned in times of depression or spawned in times of boom, or they may actually straddle boom and depression times, and they may have ideological, administrative bases. But how do they relate to different policy contexts that change over time? Are the appraisal, the planning and appraisal methodologies suited, fit for purpose for 21st century challenges? And what lessons can we carry on forward to future future decision makers for mega urban infrastructure transport projects? Okay, the methodology. I don't know, is it clear at the back there? I won't go into much detail. We were 10 groups, 10 country groups in total. What was the total? About 30? How many of us are 40? In terms of the global team? About 40. About 40. We basically had our teams, each of our teams presenting and preparing working papers, national policy working paper in infrastructure. So what's the history since the Second World War of planning and appraising major infrastructure projects? What were the sustainable development challenges that they could report upon from each of their countries? So we actually had national pictures from the 9 different countries. We mined information in the public domain on each of these projects. And now those of you who are interested, if you go to the Omega website, there is a website there of 30 projects, at least the project profiles. And I think that's the first time it's been done in such a comprehensive manner. So, and that's to be used as a platform for other people to do research. And of course there are other information of the kind I'm describing now that's available. We then obviously set up a number of issues and hypotheses that we wanted to test, but we also took advice from an ex-IBM group who have now are operating in different sectors, from the military to commerce and corporate world, of the value of knowledge embedded in the narrative. And their arguments were that in storytelling and narratives about, in this case, decision-making in mega projects, there is knowledge to be had that you will not find in academic books, textbooks, articles, and in government reports. And that was most definitely what we found. Now, one of the logistical issues involved is that there is no way you will get from interviewing these parties the kind of output that you want if you kick off with your hypotheses and your prejudice or whatever you want to call them. And so we interviewed all the parties involved with just allowing them to tell the story of the project with just a few prompting criteria. And on the basis of that, this was electronically taped. There was software that we employed with borrowed or used from the IBM, ex-IBM team. It had a software to get patterns, common patterns of knowledge that came out from the narratives, both within each country but across the countries. Then we pursued interviews across the countries, and again we tested the findings against the hypotheses. And the whole idea was then to bring these two together, to bring the responses to the unstructured inquiries with the structure to see what came out of this. And this was all based upon 30 projects. And in the countries shown here. And I should say that the level of involvement was pretty senior people. We interviewed Heseltine here in the UK and John Prescott, but also people in Bechtel. And it was the interesting, so long as they're past projects, people are prepared to talk, especially if they're retired. Okay, I'm not going to go into the pretty pictures. They are the projects we looked at. I've already talked to you about this. Okay, let's go to some of the lessons, the conclusions. The need to treat MUTPs as agents of change. This is a conclusion premised on the basis that either by design or by virtue of the nature and extent of their impacts, they act as strategic change agents that have multiple spatial, economic, environmental and other implications. They have these impacts if you plan them to have, if you don't plan them to have, and even if you plan them to have, they have unintended implications as well. So looking back, I mean, this is known and hoped for by many many politicians, because this agent of change transformation, that's particularly in developing countries, is seen as one of the major justifications for their investments. This agent of change function is often underestimated or oversold. And this jumble of overselling and underestimation leads to problems, which I suppose is resolved, no, I won't use the word resolved, is dealt with at the end of the day dealing with the simplistic iron triangle considerations, because trying to explain complex agents of change phenomena, particularly if they're speculative and cannot be proven in advance, at the end of the day people are looking for something a little bit more hard. I'm sorry, this formatting was not too good. So, the argument that we would make to any major project that is embarked upon is whether these projects are supposed to act as strategic aid agents, and if so, why and in what way. There's discussions to be had following on that, and who are the winners and who are the losers. And with that goes another discussion about transparency. Secondly, what sort of territorial, sectoral and other changes is expected to achieve? Which forces of change are they trying to influence and harness? Now, I'm making no apology here that this is an extremely complex set of issues, because we can answer these questions today. And if we're dealing with projects which take 30 years to manifest themselves into physical entities, the answers to these questions may well change, right? So we're not dealing with a static issue. We need to be clear about the forces of change that we're trying to influence and harness. Most important, because this is using infrastructure projects as agents to create or prevent other things from happening. The relationship between strategy and forces of change affecting sustainable growth, especially economic growth. Are we looking at short-term returns? I mean, this is important because some investors may be looking for short-term returns, others for long-term returns. What is it that we're expecting from the project? And at what time frame are we expecting these results? A problem with a politician is if the time frame is too long and you don't deliver the results in time for his political office. And what type of resources, financial, institutional, personnel, legal, and policy frameworks are likely to be needed to actually plan, appraise, and deliver these projects? I've already made the point. And what are the project boundaries? You know, are we just talking about a railway line? Are we talking about the urban regeneration around the stations? Or are we talking about a regional uplift? One of the very strong conclusions, hence the launching of the new MSc program, unfortunately, is that the resources available to tackle these projects have been sectoralized or been siloed, so that you can get knowledge, expertise, of very great expertise in project management, civil engineering, transport, urban planning, but to actually have these knowledge bases come together in order to take more informed decisions doesn't happen. Doesn't happen in universities, but happens in practice. But happens in practice out of the essential, about being essential to do it. And this is one major problem, a huge problem, is that the tools and toolboxes, both intellectual and the arithmetic, is not fit for purpose. One factor I've already raised that needs to be highlighted is that many of these mega projects are not projects at all. They are actually programs of projects. They're not projects. At best you can call them meta-project. A project has a very defined boundary. These don't actually have very clearly defined boundaries. So employing project management thinking to things which are not projects creates false perceptions. Having said all that, you need to be at one stage very clear. If you're going to construct a project, you can't have an open-ended project. You need this very focused, closed boundary mentality for delivering the project at some stage. You have to, but you need to open it up again. So essentially, you need to have a open systems thinking about the planning, the appraisal of mega projects. You need to close it when you come to construct it, and then you need to open it up again when you need to monitor it in terms of its performance. There's also a need to look at these mega projects against changing visions. In many instances of the projects we looked at, the vision of sustainability, and some would argue still today, was much more rhetoric than reality. However, as we move forward and as the vision becomes operationalized into more tangible issues, then projects react to this new knowledge. How fast is another matter. So there needs to be a recognition and that visions change, and that therefore the role of mega projects will change, needs to adapt. This is the organic factor as times go on. So the criteria, the objectives of a project, of a mega project, at the beginning, 30 years on when it's delivered, will differ. Now the way we look at it now is to say we judge the success and failure of these mega projects on the basis of the objectives they set out to achieve. But the objectives have changed. They either changed explicitly in reality or implicitly. So we needed to identify original objectives of the project and emergent objectives. And if you look at original objectives and delivery of project, there is a high misfit, and which is why it's fairly common to describe mega projects as failures, because they've been judged against their original objective. If, on the other hand, you trace, which is what we did, the evolution of decisions, and you identify emergent objectives, for example, in the CTRL, the objective that it should actually open up urban regeneration in the Thames Gateway, that it should act not just as a railway line, but should do much more. If you judge, which is what we did, the failure or success of these projects against emergent objectives, there's a far higher success. So we're not really doing credit, we feel, to many mega projects. The other issue has to be said, that we're also not doing credit to those who deliver the projects, because we found that the project management expertise in actually building them and delivering them was very, very impressive. And this irresponsible, I would say, from the perspective that we see it, judgment of success and failure is actually to do discredit. Having said that, there is, of course, mega projects that don't deserve to be credited with any praise, but I'm just trying to make the point methodologically. We need to be clear about what criteria used, whose criteria, who were the intended winners and losers, who were the real winners and losers, and was there an issue of justice involved? There's a broader issue. I've already, if I go into so much detail on every point, we're going to overrun, so I'm going to rush this a little bit. The open and closed systems issue is fairly straightforward to understand. There is confidence in working out calculations. If you draw a boundary around a particular area, which is what the project is, a mega project is. But as we know in the times of globalization, especially with mega projects, because many mega projects are actually agents of globalization. They are actually built to speed up interaction for trade and international connections, or for competitiveness. You are going to be impacted by factors outside of the project. And these can be well outside the project, even to the point of the price of iron ore affected, or the price of minerals being used in the construction as a result of China having bought up the large proportion of it in advance. So you've got external factors. What we're just saying here is there needs to be an acknowledgement, an honesty, a transparency about the fact that professions, as best as they do, as much money as they throw at it, that, you know, the claims of delivering what was promised according to budget, according to specifications and the like, are probably not achievable if we really, and maybe not desirable even. The other thing, of course, is that the projects are complex, as we've already, by their very definition, but they're also evolving or not evolving in complexly changing environments. And to be able to identify all this from the outset is actually extremely difficult. Now, all that open-closed system argument does is to reinforce the view that cities, regions, markets, the interdependent, they're basically an organic, there's a lot of organic elements involved. And I haven't raised this here, but one, some of us were looking at the work of contagion, well, it came in the first research, on contagion ideas and contagion forces, and these do trickle through. I mean, for example, the Malcolm Gladwell's book on tipping point, not only does fashion is a contagion, and they market fashion in a way people buy it on a global basis, but ideas, public-private partnership, I mean, sustainable development, I mean, they become packaged ideas that are contagion without rigorous analysis. And this organic connection needs to be understood, is that, you know, that there is this contagion factor, good and bad. One of the most interesting observations that came out from our interviews was that you had hard-nosed, seasoned, practical professionals who, on reflection, not all of them, I forgot what was the percentage, 57, 60%, something like that, wasn't it? That said that that big projects need time to breathe. I think about 60. About 60%. In other, the converse logic to that is if you speed up projects, you're increasing your risk factor. So here we are setting up the Infrastructure Planning Commission. We're doing things to try and speed up delivery, which, I mean, I can understand in England, it's not as if we're known for speeding up the delivery of major infrastructure projects in the last 100 years. But nevertheless, the point needs to be understood. If you're late in the game, rushing it is an issue. or if you've got the Olympic Games, but you've got a deadline of 5 years, rushing it is an issue. On the other hand, you can't allow so much time to breathe that no activity takes place. But the concept of time to breathe is actually to allow tensions to come to the forefront, opportunity for winners and losers to understand, see if there's areas of compromise, transparency, and certainly bringing participation early on actually is shown in Sweden to reduce the length and the frictions and even costs of projects ultimately. So this time to breathe issue is an important, and I think we should make the point here that this is primarily relevant to complex mega projects. The interaction between, I'm sorry, the formatting here has been lost in the presentation. Going back to this organic issue, this relationship between how the context, political, physical, geographical context, is changed by the project, but then how the project changes projects can even change institutional profiles. It can change the profiles, they're intended to do that, of areas that they traverse. What we're really asking here is to continuously revisit the purpose of the project, and to acknowledge that in revisiting the purpose over a period of time, the long period of time, that you need to acknowledge original objectives, emergent objectives, and then how judgments of success and failure should change. And how much time you should allow. This is, it's very easy for an academic such as myself to come and give these kind of talks, but when you're running these projects, it is very painful to say, okay, the time to breathe has stopped. We've actually now got to build the project. We know we can't get everyone on board. So these are hard decisions, and they have to be taken. So let's not sort of be flabby about this. But on the other hand, not to allow enough time for parties to own it, or to see how they can benefit from it, or to protect themselves from it, is making things worse. The idea that you can control and manage everything is just not realistic. It's just not realistic. And yet, this is the ethos of those who manage projects. This is their expertise. To do anything else but that is actually to suggest that they're not doing their job properly. But if you look at the way the military work, for example, the complexity of warfare and possibilities is such that they cannot control every avenue, every possibility, the resources. So you have to have a strategy. And so in this regard, the relationship of strategy with management, we found not a very comfortable one. And this calls for more robust thinking. Now, don't get me wrong, this is because I've already said that the delivery of these projects in terms of construction and project management is, we found exceptionally good, by and large, in most projects. What we found was the interface between the strategic planning context and what contribution they played to the delivery of the project. On the other side of the fence, we also found urban regional planners basically not being involved in any significant way in infrastructure planning. They felt intimidated by the quantitativeness, the sureness, the confidence of engineers and economists who came out with figures, who came out with infrastructure that would buy politicians' power. And yet, planners at one stage hold the power by giving the planning permission to give the grid. So at one stage of the game, or two, they're very powerful. But after the planning permission has been given, Or, which is more common this day, once the planners are bypassed by virtue of setting up special legislation to make these projects happen without planning procedures, then planning has lost its involvement. And that is again a problem, because planners are trained to have holistic thinking, and yet they are not involved. To give you some idea of the relationship, I'm just thinking of one quote. A question was, when you prepare these mega projects, did you take into account the strategic land use transport plan or strategic urban regional plan? And the response was, it depends whether we agreed with it or not. If they felt that the urban regional plan was not really, was too airy-fairy, was too not based upon any reality, the project creates the reality. And what's happening in urban regional planning is that the plans adapt. They're obliged to adapt. So then, if this is again not our theoretical thoughts, we're reporting back what we found. If this is the truth, then we really got to frame these projects differently. We can't treat them as projects, and yet they are projects in part. We actually have to bring together strategic thinking, understanding of complexity of the environment in which decision making takes place, and the complexity of the delivery. Put another way, the judgments of success and failure of mega projects is a partial one, if not a biased one, that we hear at the moment. We actually don't know the bigger picture. And yet, we actually need to know what successes are being achieved and under using what yardsticks in order to learn for future projects. We need to understand why it is that yesterday's failures are today's successes, or why yesterday's successes may be viewed as tomorrow's failures. We need to understand the dynamics. The real problem is, is that the power of delivering infrastructure, hard infrastructure, and spending money brings with it power, brings with it influence, brings with it image. And if you're looking at the the United Arab Republic states, or if you're looking at countries that are trying to make an impact, they use mega infrastructure as iconic symbols of economic virility or political virility. So if I was to go and sort of sit down to a political leader of country that wanted to impress, for me to tell him you need to give the projects time to breathe is not going to go down very well. And so in this regard, you need to think, more broadly. But the lesson really is the lesson of the military, is that you cannot deal with complexity without a strategy. You need to know what this mega project is strategically aiming to achieve, and you need to know what your strategy is in that role. The irony is that if you are so clear at the outset about what you want to do, you can almost suffocate the outcome 30 years ahead. I mean, the irony is that at one level, if you're not clear about what you're trying to achieve, people can criticise you for spending a lot of money on projects that are not clear from the outset. On the other hand, if you make the project so fixed from the outset, you don't allow for it to adapt to the new knowledge as it transpires. I'm going to skip through, I'm going to skip back again. I don't think I've missed out. Right. I think that that's all the points I want to. I don't know whether Phil, John, you wanted to add anything. There's of course a whole there's 6 volumes to the 5-year research, and each country has its own reports. So anyone who's particularly interested in dimensions of it, we look at different aspects from finance to planning and sustainable development. But as I have been asked to present the principal observations and conclusions and the message to an interdisciplinary audience such as yourself, this is what we have to say. So I'm happy, and I'm not going to let my colleagues get out of this. They have to answer some questions too, particularly the difficult ones. But I'm happy to take any questions.
Your presentation is based on the finding of a single project or 30 projects? 30. Right. So you take the open system and the organic perspective to examine the mega projects. But what was the solution? What was your new tool coming out of that? Because you destroyed one paradigm, and you need to create or start a new one. What's that?
Okay. We were, as a separate project, we were commissioned by the Institution of Civil Engineers and the actual profession to advise on how we could incorporate social and environmental criteria better of sustainable development into the appraisal of mega infrastructure projects. And I won't give you a full rundown on that, but in that research, which complemented the research we had here, we found that the reliance upon cost-benefit analysis as a tool for judging success or failure was a huge issue. 82%, is that right, of those interviewed, these were practitioners from the World Bank, European Investment Bank, and practitioners, argued that the tools of cost-benefit analysis, which many of us knew anyway, is not fit for purpose for mega projects. Having said that, their role for financial investors, particularly stakeholders, is very pertinent. But the conclusion, in terms of what we came out with it, our conclusion was, and it was the work which we did in association with SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit in Sussex, that, and their work was in the health industry, was that if you had a multi-criteria framework in which you located cost-benefit analysis tool, and if this multi-criteria framework was policy-informed, anyone can have a policy, a multi-criteria policy, and you're, depending on what your driver is, I can have a multi-criteria framework and have as my driver, which is I think what the Treasury has today, economic growth. And then, so I will judge my project as a failure because they haven't created instant economic growth. So let's make it very clear. So the response that we have is as follows, is that the tools that are being employed for planning and appraising mega projects are not fit for purpose. They're not fit for purpose because they focus on, and the politicians understand this, because very few politicians actually adhere to the cost-benefit analysis ratios. So it's not as if we're saying something revolutionary here. So what we're arguing for is a transparent, multi-criteria framework in which winners and losers can be seen, in which stakeholders are identified, but which is led by policy directives, whether it's to do with sustainable developments, about speed of economic growth, that is fed into it, and that over time, this multi-criteria approach needs to be, from the beginning, the day you conceive the project, to the monitoring of it afterwards, and then you can trace how policy has changed, how judgments of criteria has changed, and who are the winners or losers in terms of that criteria. The danger of that kind of argument, I can see, and you're not from the Treasury, but if I was to present that kind of argument to the Treasury, there are two issues. One is a political advisor from Sweden told me the last thing we want is technocrats to tell politicians to box us in, the politicians, into very narrow tick box achievements, right? So that's one thing you've got to be aware of. The second thing is that there has been a tradition in many countries, not Sweden, where actually the last thing you want is transparency. But if you look at, retrospectively as we did, at the JLE, at CTRL, but if you look at the French experience, that's exactly what has happened, is that informally they've used multi-criteria appraisal, which has not been declared. And some of it can be questioned because it's not been declared. So on the one hand, the real world, our textbooks that we give you guys, is cost-benefit analysis and all these, the real world isn't doing it. They do it, but these studies are not adhered to. So why? Either these cost-benefit analysis studies are not done properly, or the politicians are too irresponsible, they're not listening to us technocrats. That's where the argument. It's not like that at all. It's because politicians, policymakers, community people, they understand that these projects are agents of change, and there hasn't been a plugging up. You could say, and I'd ask the same question, how is it internationally we're building so many multi-billion-dollar projects that we've got this piddly little outfit at UCL coming up with these conclusions? Why hasn't something been done before? Why haven't these lessons been disseminated before? And I was shocked to hear, but I mean my shock was in my stupidity, realizing my stupidity, is that this knowledge does exist, but it's been privatized, it's being kept within the private sector who are involved, because it's seen as competitively gives them a market edge over competitors. So what's happening is that the public sector is paying out huge projects. We're funding the knowledge base of the private sector, and that lesson is being kept within their boundaries, not being shared. And just to make this point before we take the next question, to show you how ridiculous it is, when South East England Development Agency was operational, they wanted to do a survey of passengers on Eurostar to see and monitor the performance of the CTRL. They were not allowed to do so by Eurostar, which is actually funded by the French government and the English government, on the basis that it was a private company. And so there's no way, one of the implications, that we're going to be able to monitor the success and failure of projects, because the access to information is not necessarily available. And indeed, we had problems accessing some feasibility studies. Now, the more private sector funding you rely on, and the more you accept that the knowledge that's created as a result of that belongs to the consultants or the contractors, the less we can share and build forward. Now, I do think, without wishing to sound too negative, on the positive side, there are realizations of sharing this knowledge now of being commercially valuable. And so that this is beginning to happen. But it's taken a very long time. So taking multi-criteria analysis, for example, that's been around 30 years. Cost-benefit analysis failure has been around 50 years. You have to ask the question, or am I being too cynical, why is it we haven't made the progress that we have? The engineering successes, however, is a different story. But that's not what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a key understanding is that appraisal before the scheme is built is only ever going to be partial. So there's never ever going to be this brilliant toolkit, in my view, that will mean that we know what all the impacts are going to be, because they emerge over time and we can't quantify some of the very important things like the regeneration or the developmental impacts. And I think that's a really important thing, is that the appraisal is only ever going to be partial. And we don't appreciate that at all.
Well, no, we appreciate it very much as partial, because the cost-benefit analysis makes it very clear to those who've been left out of it that it is partial. No, I don't think that's true. I think many people are very aware that they're being marginalised by these partial views. I think the problem is that some parties have it in their mind that at the end of the day, travel time saving is what it's all about. How many minutes or whatever it is that the economic costs is what it's all about. Now, because you cannot quantify, this takes you into the issue of monetization, which is what we dealt with in the other project. This takes you into the issue of, if you can't monetize and quantify something, does it make it less important or more important? Who knows? But you need to judge it, and it goes back yet again to the military perspective, because they can't quantify everything. You need to take a strategic judgment, and you need to be prepared to change your strategic judgment as new knowledge comes about. Now, I appreciate the point you're making, but the argument I'm saying is if we had a systematic learning procedure from previous experiences, international, over the last 20 years on mega projects, I think we would have made more progress than we have now, where we're basically at a standstill. I have to say that some countries have done this, and the Japanese, and the French, and the Germans, and the Hong Kong too. So there is evidence. Don't let me paint everything. I mean, the Hong Kong projects prior to 1997 very much had a strategic change function. Very much. They were not just...
Can I ask you a question, Harry? When you talk about this, I've worked in small government departments, but when you think of privatising the knowledge, so for instance, accounting has a highways department, and then they outsource all their highways information. There's a lot of people here that will belong to government departments and big government groups. Now, the examples you mentioned, France, Germany, and Japan, it seemed to me that they are centralised governmental organisations who would have some of the knowledge that you were talking about in-house, and that's probably why they've got that knowledge. Can you comment on that? Does it seem that privatising all of your consultancy effort means that the organisation loses something in the end?
Well, this goes back to the point I made right at the outset, and how much of the observations we make is of generic value. And I think my privatisation stories were really about the English experience here, because in the Japanese situation, and to a certain degree in the Hong Kong situation, what you've got is a much closer relationship between the public and private sectors. You actually have private sectors that are conglomerates of the same entity ultimately. The railway companies are the same as the real estate, and they have the same roots. And so there's a holistic picture of infrastructure based upon the same people, the bankers, the same people, the retail, the store, department stores, the train operators, and the real estate. And in that regard, their relationship with government is kind of hand in glove, in that the government provides strategic green ticket, green light, in order for this infrastructure. What's interesting about Japan is that the construction industry and the reliance on infrastructure actually so important to the economy that they were building projects people would argue they didn't need, because if you didn't actually build them, you would actually have implications. And so I kind of call that the bulimic situation of infrastructure, bulimia, too much. And Hong Kong, I would argue the same. The developers, and this is the lesson has to be learned, is that the Hong Kong investors know that without a strategy, without government providing a strategy, they don't know where they're going to maximise their profits. This is not a, this is a relationship that can make some sense. Another lesson, which is from elsewhere, not from the project, is that good private sector involvement in mega infrastructure needs strong public sector competence. Strong public sector competence needs people capable to dialogue with the private sector in a manner where both parties understand, so that you don't have planners frightened to talk about money, you don't have planners frightened of engineers, and you don't have engineers dismissive of strategic thinking on a territorial spatial way. And the optimistic part of my message to you is I believe a generation of these people are coming about, but they're coming out despite the system. They're not coming out as a result of it yet.
I have a related question to that. The human factor, especially in the private sector, think, over the public is often a rapid churn of the people involved in projects. Is that something that was part of the research work, especially in some of these long-term projects, where those people who were there taking the decisions at the beginning are not necessarily there at the end?
No, let me answer. In terms of the project management of the projects, or in terms of the design, I think that the industry, both in the public and private sector, accept that as a fact of life. But where it becomes significant is in terms of political champions, is that many of these mega projects really happen only if you've got political champions that make it happen. And of course this is very much better understood in the developing world, but it's also true here. And the institutional fragmentation, as we've seen in England, can be a threat to the planning and to the delivery of them. So continuity and maintaining pressure, I would also say, let me say something else, which is something we learned, and I didn't want to give the impression that's contrary to this. It needs to be understood that visions, new ideas come from everywhere. And the Canary Wharf would never have happened if this guy from New York didn't come across and persuade Margaret Thatcher. He had a vision, and then he persuaded a politician. But that vision didn't get translated into the vision he had directly. It then involved the planners in adapting the JLE line or the CTRL line, and this is the organic side of it. And you have this public-private relationship, which I consider healthy. But of course, you know, I can see some members of the audience saying, well, it's healthy, you know, but what about the people who are impacted by it? You know, it's healthy for the king players, but what about those who are impacted? That's another side to it. So let's not, and forgive me if I gave you that impression, let's not go into the bad guys and good guys, the private and public. No, it's the partnership bit, and I think the partnership is where is the rhetoric, is that actually, I've talked to people, influential investors in real estate, who really feel we need to move into a new way of operating in this field, which again is one reason why I've launched this new master's program with Volvo. And Volvo is also very keen on this, because we feel that there needs to be a breaking down of old silos and bringing together the innovation of the private sector of visions and the adaptation of that to the public sector. Because in the case of the JLE, they weren't just servicing the needs of Canary Wharf. This was actually making East London more accessible to other opportunities. Yeah.
Since mega projects are programs, not projects, still the government and the private sector are treating them as one entity, the same. So do you think that we should have a new procurement strategy for mega projects?
Procurement of hardware, or procurement of software, or
starting from the software.
I think that the partnership, this concept of partnership, needs to leave the field of rhetoric and move into reality. I think that the private sector, the Bechtels, the Arabs of this world, of course one's a project manager and the other one's a consulting engineer. I think that the big players, it's in their interest to help build up the public sector capacity so that they have people to talk to on the other side. And to almost do an audit, which is what we try to do in part, but we didn't do an audit of project management, we did an audit of strategic planning, appraisal, and touch just on the field of project management. I think there needs to be an audit of what we do well, an audit of what we do badly, an audit of who pays for what, and who are the real winners and losers. And then on the basis of that, you know, and unintended, and on the basis of that, use that as a knowledge base to build up a new cadre of thinking that crosses sectors. I mean, one thing I haven't said, but I have in the lectures for the course, you know, when you lecture and you do reading for lectures, you learn as well. But I've been totally taken back, surprised, by the power of soft infrastructure on hard infrastructure. The regulation, now we're talking about pension funds. I mean, all you need, all this will not happen if funding dries up. if you have a global crisis, or if you have funding that's in the hands of only a few countries. So the banking system that funds infrastructure, which is I call soft infrastructure, is very, very important. And that's taken me by surprise, is that, you know, we tend to be too preoccupied with the hardware side and the delivery of it, but actually we can have a project torpedoed by global financial crisis that moves all the money into particular areas that raises the cost or not.
And how would you balance that versus your other types of risk, like giving a given project time to breathe? How would you balance budget funding, which can, over 2 decades, can go in and out several times?
That's right. Look, I don't want to be sitting here with a guy with all the answers, right? Yeah. So don't misinterpret that. I'm of the view that you need to, going back to our work on risk, uncertainty and complexity, I'm of the view that we need to undertake risk assessments of different kinds on mega infrastructure. I'm of the view, and I'll say it very clearly, that there's a risk, a security risk of actually having, this may sound very nationalistic, but this is not where I'm coming from. There's a security risk in having strategic infrastructure of the UK in the hands of other unknown parties, more than 49%. Sovereign wealth funds are now being approached to invest our infrastructure. Well, sovereign wealth funds are not answerable to anyone. So, and it can be pulled, the money, it can be done with, or they can change the priorities of the project. Of course, everyone assures everyone else. I mean, I raised this issue with Michael Heseltine. And he said, okay, we'll just nationalise it. It doesn't happen like, especially if you haven't got the money to actually back up and you take it to legal courts. So I think that the risk analysis needs to go beyond the structure of the projects. I think there need to be strategic issues. Now, having said that, even let's get this clear, and the military will also say this: you cannot have a comprehensive risk analysis of everything. You know, this is the very nature of the beast, and especially over a long time span. So you're confronted with the same complexities, if not much greater. You're taking high risks, and this needs to be understood. I think at the end of the day, the media in particular, we had long discussions with Chris Walmar about this. The media wants to present quick fix, high visible infrastructure projects that do this, do that, do that. The public, the media need to understand that these are high risk projects, and more the reason, if they are high risk, why we shouldn't do our due diligence on them. And we're doing due diligence, going back to your point, Rob, we're just doing it in a very narrow field. And even that we're not taking serious. I mean, I could reconstrue my lecture today to saying cost-benefit analysis has been misused and ignored, and you know all the lessons. I mean, I could construe like that. Is that we're not, even what the tools that we claim to use, we're not using them properly. And the irony is, where we are good, and I'm talking about globally, is actually in the what we are good is actually the construction of the project. I mean, we've been in all the projects that we've seen, the ingenuity of man and getting these projects delivered is a huge achievement. I mean, it really is. And furthermore, one other point that we learned is that you hear about these guys were involved in crisis management. That's to be respected. The skills in crisis management. And if you look at what's happening, because crises is a fact of life with high-risk projects. And that's the problem, is that the parties involved are not getting the credit for what is being achieved. And we're claiming credit for things that we've not got the basis to justify the claims of credit. And most worrying of all is we don't actually monitor the projects once they're built. We don't actually say, well, are they doing? We spent billions what happens is the industry is looking for the next project. Now all this has to change if we are to take sustainability seriously, because we can't afford to build project after project. Of course some countries can, but if climate change and other issues are truly going to be an issue, then we'll find that we're going to have to spend more money on them to retrofit them. And in economies which are failing economies or economies that have problems, you will be sure if there are excessive expenditures on these kind of projects, that if the poor are left out, and if these poor are significant, if you build, as you have in Delhi, a metro system, and you actually don't provide access to affordable access, let alone physical access, to the slum dwellers or whatever, you're going to find that you can only build these big projects for so long without social unrest taking place. And this is going to be an issue in China, without doubt.
I mean, yeah, surely what you're talking about there really is the political dimension, which is actually kind of really unquantifiable. It's impossible really to explain it, because projects will be driven by particular political interests, and you talk about security interests, that there are some things which you will not allow to happen or which you will push to happen for security reasons, like say nuclear power or something like that, which will have its own implications. So, I mean, that's really, how do you, I mean, we had this discussion last time with the last speaker, and I can't really see how you really get around that, because if you're talking about sustainability again, this also requires a kind of political input, and you have so many different interests playing into it.
That's right.
That's one point. But the other thing is also, you were talking about the information that's available and the possibility.
Can I deal with the political thing first? Yeah, and then I'll...
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Alan Altshuler makes this very clear in his book on mega projects. And this is why I'm finding the discussions all around finishing projects on time, in budget, you know, I'm finding that not a non-discussion. It misses out the fact that there are political dimensions here which are not necessarily about corruption. They're about achieving goals that the market doesn't necessarily allow. So if you look at the work of Robert Moses in New York, there is an unhealthy relationship, Mussolini, the Nazis in Germany, there is an unhealthy relationship between mega projects and autocratic governments. Singapore, I won't use Hong Kong, but you know. So, you know, it's easier to deliver a mega project where you have less questions. But the lessons that Sweden, not so much France, the lessons that Sweden offers is in this transparency is that you can actually reduce the conflict and tension. But if you have early consultation, it may not be the project that the engineer or the planner want from the outset, and that's the whole point about the education of professionals, is that we need to de-hook ourselves from the view that the engineer or the planner knows best. And you know, we actually supposed to say, well, there are political realities, and make pathways where these can be shared. Now, this is not easy. This is not easy. And I would actually go far as to say that you need people in that with certain talents. But they exist. And all we have at the moment are people with these talents who are actually working in a situation that it is not conducive to producing value for money. In fact, it's the opposite. It's conducive for path-dependent solutions that we know don't work. Sorry, your second question?
Well, the second point was about, you said that the information about the impacts and so on is available, or there are problems with having this information. You're giving us the example of the case of the Channel Tunnel, you know, that you couldn't get access to passengers and so on. But, I mean, actually, I would say that a lot of information has been available for a long time, but that people haven't really wanted to look at it. And I'm talking here about, for example, criticisms which have been made of projects of this by different kinds of NGOs over the years, which have actually in many ways driven the kind of, the whole sustainability argument that's really come out of environmentalism, which is outside of government systems. And you take, for example, criticisms of dams and things like that, where lots of NGOs have made criticisms of the impacts of dams, the way they don't necessarily produce the expected result, the damage they do to communities and uprooting people and so on. So I mean, there have been a lot of criticism which have been available. The question is whether authorities...
I didn't say that the criticisms were
No,
not...
okay, right. So whether people are prepared to listen to this stuff, or it takes time for that to feed into the system, because people don't really want to know.
Yeah, forgive me, that's a different issue.
Yeah, okay.
You're talking about views, about projects that are those who consider themselves poorly treated by it, or feel that they're actually not warranted. A contrary view.
Not necessarily. No. I'm talking about people who may, for example, like I'm particularly thinking about dams, which say in India, places like that, where there's been a great emphasis. I'm not talking about transport problems here.
Yeah.
Where you've had people who, for a long time, we're not talking about the impact on the people who are victims, you might say, who have to move, but just the effectiveness of the dams themselves, and whether they actually produce the electricity that they're meant to, and whether they start jamming up with silt and so on and so forth. So you have technical issues, which are discussed by NGOs in the field, who are experts in the field.
Absolutely. The point that we're making, or that we found, was that actually some of the technical information upon which ostensibly the decisions were made were not available. And we still don't know what the real cost of the regeneration land for the CTRL to the Treasury.
Sure.
Just take a couple more, and then we'll conclude. A couple more.
I just have a question a bit more specific. That given these guidelines that you've put together of 30 projects,
observations,
observations, was there one that kind of stood out as particularly successful in its own right, or was it kind of bits and pieces from all of the studies?
Sorry, are you asking me if any of those projects were successful?
Well, no, I mean like that you found, like given these kind of guidelines and suggestions that you put forward, was there any that you felt kind of had followed them quite well as?
Oh, I see. That's a good question.
You would have to say that, I mean, we didn't sort of kind of rank them in that sense. And when you talk about success or failure, you say from whose perspective as well.
Right.
All of them, I would say, in terms of as Harry mentioned, delivering a particular piece of hard infrastructure was successful, by and large. All of them suffered in one way or another from the sorts of issues that we've been talking about. The underestimation of the ability of a project to change the context into which it's delivered, and to be changed by the context in which it's delivered, was significant on a number of occasions. So it's very hard in that sense to say that was more successful than that one. Plus, with the danger is you fall into the trap of saying, well, it's a success, but is it going to be a success in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, in 20 years' time? Will the context in which it sits have changed so fundamentally? And we go, in a sense, goes to your dam issue as well. Will the context have changed so dramatically as to make that piece of infrastructure obsolete, for example, or its principal function obsolete, or indeed whether it's capable of being adapted in some way to address a new context in, say, 30 years' time. So, fundamentally, I'd have to say it's success from whose, and failure from whose perspective, and when do you look at it? And that's one of the challenges that we kind of faced with this, and unashamedly, we've saw, very early on, we kind of cautioned ourselves about being too prescriptive in terms of the advice, because today's lesson about a particular project is not necessarily applicable, although it's good to have a body of evidence. It's not necessarily applicable to something that happens in 10 years' time, for obvious reasons. So the power of context is extremely important in judging success and failure in all of these.
It's a very, very good question, though, because the right way I read it was to say, well, given that you came up with these observations, and actually we do call them lessons at some stage, so which of these projects you looked at sort of get the brownie points? And we actually haven't done that as such, because what we've done is we learned lessons from all these stories, and we didn't then use it as a matrix to go back and say this was successful. But and maybe we should. But there's no doubt about it that different places show different successes and different failures. and that's a geographical, cultural issue. So in that regard, the parts of the ideal is in different places. But, okay, what I can do, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Phil and John, vision is a driving force. Countries that don't actually have a vision of their national direction of development, in other words, they don't have a clear role for the infrastructure, right. Come out a little bit more worse.
We certainly noticed, I mean, there's in a number of country contexts, it was quite evident that the sort of related planning followed the project, sometimes with quite disastrous consequences as well. And for example, in parts of Greece, you know, the sort of planning regime wasn't set up to do it really very much about the kind of suburban sprawl that was encouraged by some of these mega projects. So that's kind of one example.
And strong political leadership, the capacity of that leadership to make things happen. Last question.
Thinking about the projects that you did in England, I'm just thinking about conflicting interests. Thinking from the planning point of view, like local authorities, they've all got their own individual targets that they get funding from, their employment figures, housing figures. To what extent was that a hindrance in these projects? It's often planners look at things very, very locally, and obviously these projects are now regional, and you do often get these conflicting interests, and then because of those conflicting interests, often you get objectives which are maybe added on in a token fashion.
I'm going to let you guys answer that.
Well, I think in the context of the UK projects that we looked at, I'd have to say that because they were by and large kind of managed fairly centrally, you know, as I talked about this morning, you know, certainly with regard to the CTRL, and the attitude of local authorities to the project was really different depending on where you were and what you stood to gain out of it. But that also followed through somewhat in relation, for example, to the M6 toll road. I think it was less of an issue in relation to the JLE. But what you also observe is that these guys weren't really in the local planning authority, especially tooled up to kind of make the most of the opportunities of those projects. They were very aware of the problems, particularly noise and nuisance and all the rest of it. And so they spent a lot of time on mitigation, but only in a few instances where did they tool themselves up in terms of you know, grasping the opportunity that was kind of presented, for better or for worse. I mean, you know, you might argue about the outcome. Certainly, Neom Council, as I mentioned this morning, were very well tooled up in that sense.
Take the last question. What I will say, one thing we didn't mention is one of the findings was that there was, in many instances, an observation that some of these projects just took off because it was the time that certain opportunities came together. In other words, it was serendipity, and it was it kind of scary in a way. It's kind of the planetary alignment syndrome. Yes, last question. Yeah, right at that.
Sorry. Regarding your argument of agent of change as one of the main issues with the mega projects, what are the conditions that need to be met in order to be considered a mega project? And I'm talking from the point of view of a public authority, even a government. If I have to make a decision whether to give the relevance it demands to a particular project and compare it to another choice I have, when the question is, did you examine the line that divides those projects that are actually relevant and should be considered in a mega project agent of change way compared to others that do not really qualify with that criteria?
So you're asking, how do you decide whether a mega project is to be used as a major agent of change?
Yeah.
it is true to say, unfortunately, that in many political circles it is assumed that once you've got a mega project built, that you're going to get kudos out of it, and that it's going to have a change, which is desirable, which is not necessarily the case. I think the agent of change function can only take place in a development strategy which adheres to both local and global issues. I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit tired. There was an answer to your question earlier on. I'm just trying to sort of quickly recapture it.
We didn't, I mean, just if I can just interject, we didn't set out to kind of define what was a mega project and what was not a mega project, except in our own terms for the purpose of the research. And we did define that as being worth 5 billion at 1990 prices, and had the potential to effect very substantial either organic or planned change over time. So we kind of set our own parameters in that sense. But I mean, I think we can all come up with examples of fairly small projects, transport projects, that with almost no planning, of the surrounding area can have fairly substantial impact. One I know very well, which is
it's just that I put myself into the position of an authority, where I received 500 projects, and then at the end of the day I have to decide which one I have to give the care and attention they deserve, and which one should be cut out of the list, or at least put to next year or something like that.
I just remembered the answer I was going to give you earlier. This was not part of the research, but it's a conclusion I arrived at as a result of thinking about this work, and also UN Habitat work that I'm doing at the moment. I've come to the conclusion, generally speaking, unfortunately, perhaps, maybe, that urban and regional planning as an influential way of thinking for restructuring space, cities, regions, has unfortunately become so ineffectual, and that mega projects appear throughout the world to beginning to predetermine what planners can do and afterwards. Many mega projects are beginning to restructure territories, and planners are having to catch up or adapt or whatever. On that premise, to answer your question, to think strategically and practically, I would argue that mega projects, because wherever there's a problem, there's an opportunity. I would argue that mega projects, if it is a problem, can be used as an opportunity, as a vehicle for creating integrated land use, sustainable patterns of development. Because they often create new institutions just to deliver it. And if you get this integrated thinking, and if you get the local and the global together, mega projects can be for the good. However, if you just have mega projects as not part of that strategy, it's just a bridge, and it's just a metro network. So that, if I was in that situation, I would actually see which of the projects offer the opportunities to create integrated sustainable development, which is basically what TOD is about. And how can I ride the tiger? How can I ride the mega project tiger to achieve these other objectives that master planning has not achieved? I don't know what other people think is wrong, but I mean, I don't welcome that as a development that I would have wanted, but that's the reality in Delhi, it's the reality in Mumbai, it's the reality in many places. And that's where I think if you can get like-minded people, investors, engineers, planners, to think in those terms, then there's an opportunity to be had. I think we better stop there before everyone walks out on me. Yeah. Thanks very much for coming.